a coastline in the west of Ireland. The air tastes of salt and peat smoke. The sky is heavy, too heavy, like a lid pressed down on the world. And then the horizon moves. A fleet comes in from the sea, and what reaches land isn't just ships, it's a darkness. In Lebor Gabála Érenn, the medieval Book of the Taking of Ireland, edited and translated in the Irish Text Society edition by R.A. Stewart McAllister, the newcomers are said to arrive in dark clouds, and the sun is blotted out for 3 days and 3 nights. And when they make shore, the stories insist on one detail: they burn their own ships, not to hide their tracks. Not only as a vow, but as if to say, there is no going back. These are the Tuatha Dé Danann. And the question that haunts every version of the legend is the same. Were they gods wearing human shapes, or humans turned into gods by the force of story? Welcome to Beat Nomads History and Myths Awakened, the show where we tell old stories with new care. Today's episode is about Tuatha Dé Danann, usually translated as Folk of the Goddess Danu. Our setting is medieval Ireland's great mythic histories, texts copied by Christian scribes, yet filled with older, pre-Christian figures that refuse to stay buried. And here's our roadmap. We'll trace the Tuatha Dé Danann from their earliest major written sources, follow the legend as it shifts across manuscripts and centuries, and then ask what this story reveals about sovereignty, craft, invasion, and the strange idea that a people can be defeated and still remain. So let's begin with the first problem the legend gives us. Not the battles, not the magic, but the ink. When people say ancient Irish myth, it's easy to imagine a single timeless tradition, unchanging, purely oral, passed down intact. The reality is more complicated. One of the central sources for the Tuatha Dé Danann is Lebor Gabála Érenn, usually translated as the Book of the Taking of Ireland, or Book of Invasions. Modern historians describe it as a pseudo-history, a tapestry of prose and verse that arranges Ireland's legendary past into a sequence of migrations and conquests. According to modern reference summaries like the World History Encyclopedia entry on Lebor Gabála Érenn, the compilation reaches its early form in the 11th century, while later manuscript witnesses are medieval copies and recensions rather than a single original. And as a practical point for us as storytellers, the earliest major surviving manuscript of the Lebor Gabála tradition is often dated to the 12th century, a point also noted in modern academic publishing excerpts that discuss the text's manuscript survival. So, our earliest written witnesses are medieval. But that doesn't mean the traditions were invented in the Middle Ages. It means they were recorded, filtered, sometimes reshaped. A 2025 University of Galway thesis by Martin Sykes, focused on how the Tuatha Dé Danann are used in Lebor Gabála Érenn, argues that the text's presentation is strongly shaped by medieval Christian learning and by a process scholars call euhemerism, the reframing of old gods as exceptional mortals so that a Christian writer can preserve them without openly endorsing pagan worship. That's the first key context. The Tuatha Dé Danann stand at a crossroads, part divine, part historical, part literary. And we can watch that tension at work by looking at the other major source beside the Lebor Gabála, the saga called Cath Maige Tuired, the Battle of Maige Tuired. There isn't just one Cath Maige Tuired either. Modern descriptions, including the overview in the Cath Maige Tuired reference page, note that the title refers to 2 different battles, one against the Firbolg and a second against the Fomorians. Those battles will give us our narrative spine. But before the fighting, the legend tells us where the Tuatha came from. And that origin story isn't a single settled thing. It's already a legend with variants. Because even in medieval Ireland, before modern novels, films, or fantasy games, the story couldn't keep itself still. So far, we've placed our feet on the manuscript ground, medieval sources, Christian scribes, and a story that's already older than its earliest pages. Now, we step into the mist. As the legend opens its gates, it begins with learning. In Whitley Stokes' 1891 translation of Cath Maige Tuired, reprinted in modern educational editions, The Tuatha Dé Danann are said to have been in the northern isles of the world, studying lore, magic, and druidry until they surpassed the sages of the arts of heathendom. And then comes one of the most famous motifs, the four cities. Phalias, Gorias, Findias, Murias. In that same translation, the cities are schools of power, each associated with a treasure, each guarded by a master, figures described as poets or wizards depending on the text. From Phalias, the Leophale, the stone of Phal, which cries out beneath the rightful king. From Gorias, the spear of Lugh, a weapon no battle can withstand. From Findias, the sword of Nuada, irresistible once drawn. From Murias, the cauldron of the Dagda, which sends no company away unsatisfied. These objects do more than look impressive. They explain the Tuatha Dé Danann. The stone is sovereignty. The spear is victory. The sword is lawful force. The cauldron is abundance and hospitality. In modern terms, the legend is building a society out of symbols. But even here, we have to slow down because the story varies. In McAllister's translation of Lebor Gabála Érenn, the narrative offers more than one explanation of the Tuatha's arrival. One account has them come in dark clouds by druidry. Another says they came by sea, and that the fog of smoke from their burning ships led people to claim they arrived in a mist. And when modern scholarship summarizes the textual history of the four treasures, it notes that not every recension of Lebor Gabála Érenn gives the same list. The earliest recension described in some modern summaries mentions only the Leophale, while later texts, and an interpolated introduction attached to Cath Maige Tuired, expand the motif into the full set of four. So the four treasures are not just ancient artifacts. They are also evidence of a living, edited tradition. A myth that's being elaborated, perhaps because the symbols are too useful to let go. And then the Tuatha Dé Danann step onto Ireland. In the Lebor Gabála account, translated by McAllister, they land in Connaught, on the mountains of the Con Maicne, bringing darkness over the sun, and they burn their ships so that neither enemies can steal them nor the Tuatha themselves can retreat. It's a story of arrival that already sounds like fate. And fate, in this myth, has a name. It's kingship. Because the Tuatha don't come to trade. They come to rule. And Ireland is not empty. So far, we've met a people defined by learning and by four objects that encode their ideals. Now, we reach the first collision, where sovereignty is decided not by speech, but by battle. The first great war of the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland is against the Firbolg. Modern summaries of the Cath Maige Tuired tradition describe this as the first battle of Maige Tuired, a struggle that ends with the Tuatha taking the kingship of Ireland. And in the narrative preserved in sources like Lebor Gabála Érenn and the Maige Tuired traditions, the victory is immediate, but it comes with a wound. Their king, Nuada, loses an arm or hand, depending on translation. That detail matters more than the body count. Because in the medieval Irish ideology reflected in these tales, a king is not simply a war leader. A king is a living symbol of the land's order. Wholeness, being unblemished, is not cosmetic, it's cosmic. In the Tuatha Dé Danann narrative, as summarized in modern reference treatments, Nuada's loss means he can't remain king, and so the sovereignty passes to Bres. Bres is a fascinating hinge in the story. He is described in many retellings as half Fomorian, connected by blood to the mythic rivals of the Tuatha. And in the Tuatha's own logic, that mixed lineage becomes a test. In Elizabeth A. Gray's translation of Cath Maige Tuired, the saga paints Bres's reign as oppressive, marked by complaint, by a breakdown of hospitality, and by the humiliation of poets. And then, in one of the most striking mythic technologies of Irish tradition, the poet does what warriors cannot. He speaks. In Gray's translation, a poet comes seeking hospitality, receives a miserly welcome, and composes a satire, one of those dangerous, socially binding forms of speech that early Irish literature treats as capable of real consequence. The result is not only shame, it is blight. Bres's prosperity collapses. and the Tuatha decide to take their kingship back. But they still have a problem. Nuada is still maimed, so the legend brings in its healers. In modern summaries of the Tuatha Dé Danann cycle, Dian Cecht replaces Nuada's arm with a working silver one. But the story complicates itself further. Dian Cecht's son Miach restores flesh over the silver through a spell, joint to joint, sinew to sinew, in the remembered formula. And then, in a moment that never quite stops being shocking, Dian Cecht kills his own son, an act explained in the saga tradition as jealousy. So sovereignty is restored, but the wound remains in another form. Because Bres does not vanish. In Gray's translation, Bres seeks counsel and calls upon Balor, grandson of Net, gathering forces from Lochlin and from the Hebrides and building a bridge of ships toward Ireland. The story isn't done with invasion. It's only changing its invaders. And now the question becomes bigger than kingship. Because the enemy is not just another human like people. It is the Fomorians. And the Fomorians, in many scholarly readings, represent what a settled, fertile society fears most, the destructive powers of nature, storm, blight, chaos. In other words, the Tuatha Dé Danann are about to fight the world itself. So far, the legend has tested kingship with a single brutal rule. The king must be whole. Now, we move to the second battle, where wholeness is no longer enough, and the story demands a different kind of power. As the legend turns toward its most famous war, it introduces a figure who feels almost designed to solve a crisis. In Gray's translation of Cath Maige Tuired, after Bres's reign ends and Nuada is restored to kingship, the Tuatha hold a great feast at Tara. And as the hall fills with noise and status and ritual, a young warrior approaches. The doorkeeper stops him. Because Tara is not just a place. It is an institution. And the gatekeeping question is simple. What art do you practice? In Gray's translation, the newcomer answers again and again. Builder, smith, champion, harper, warrior, poet and historian, sorcerer, physician, cupbearer, brazier. Each time the doorkeeper replies, "We already have one." Until the stranger says the line that cracks the whole logic of the court. Ask the king whether he has one person who possesses all these arts. Because if he does, then the stranger will leave. And if he doesn't, then Tara must admit him. This figure is Lugh. In some versions, he is called Samil Danach, the one of many arts. And notice what that means. Lugh is not introduced as a sword. He is introduced as a resume. As if the story is telling us, brute strength won't save you from what's coming. You need skill, coordination, the unity of crafts. That theme runs deep. In Cath Maige Tuired, the Tuatha prepare through smithing, healing, and the machinery of war, while the Fomorian threat becomes overwhelming. And in Gray's translation, the Fomorian host includes Balor, whose defining feature is not a weapon he wields, but an eye. Balor's eye is described as destructive, opened only on the battlefield. 4 men used to lift up the lid of the eye with a polished handle which passed through its lid, and once it's open, any host that looks upon it loses the will to resist. The story even offers an origin explanation. Balor once looked into a window where his father's druids were brewing magic, and the fumes settled into his eye, turning it venomous. Then comes the moment the legend seems to have been moving toward all along. Lugh meets Balor. Balor demands that his eyelid be lifted. And in Gray's translation, Lugh, Balor's grandson, casts a sling stone that drives the eye through Balor's head, so that Balor's own forces look upon its power. Balor falls, and the victory shifts the balance of the world. In some tellings summarized in modern mythography, Lugh becomes king after Nuada's death, and the Tuatha Dé Danann have, at least temporarily, won the right to be the ordering power of Ireland. But if this were a straightforward triumph myth, it would end here. Instead, the legend makes a stranger choice. It introduces another invasion. and it refuses to let the Tuatha Dé Danann remain openly sovereign. Because the story is building toward the most enduring transformation of all, not a battle, a disappearance. So far, the Tuatha Dé Danann have won by learning, by craft, and by a champion who embodies every art. Now, the legend asks a different question. What happens to a divine people after they lose? As the legend travels through the Lebor Gabála Érenn tradition, it introduces the final human claimants, the Milesians. In modern summaries of the Tuatha Dé Danann narratives, the Milesians arrive from the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, often linked in the text's pseudo-historical logic to Spain, and they come to take the land. The Lebor Gabála story gives the Tuatha a last luminous moment of authority. Three goddesses, Eru, Banba, and Fodla, meet the Milesians and ask that the island be named for them, a detail preserved in many modern retellings and summaries of the tradition. But the key action is the negotiation. In the Lebor Gabála tradition, the Milesians agree to temporarily withdraw beyond a boundary, often framed as a set distance over the waves, while the Tuatha raise a magical storm to drive them away. And then a poet intervenes. Amergin. The Milesian poet calms the sea with verse, and the Milesians land. The Tuatha are defeated. Here is where later folklore loves to enter, the moment the gods become fairies. But the medieval texts are more precise than modern pop culture usually is. A crucial witness here is the medieval saga Mesca Ulad, The Intoxication of the Ulstermen, available in a scholarly edition and translation through University College Cork. In its opening section, the text describes how the sons of Mill outwit the Tuatha Dé Danann and how Amergin divides Ireland in two. The part above ground goes to the Milesians, and the part underground goes to the Tuatha Dé Danann. So the Tuatha do not vanish. They are assigned. They go into hills and fairy places, into the Cid. And that word, Cid, matters, because it's easy, today, to treat the fairies as a separate later invention. But the scholarship suggests continuity. A Cambridge teaching handout on mounds, graves, and the other world notes that one of the earliest extant uses of the word Cid appears in Tyrchin's Collectanea, a 7th century Latin text about St. Patrick. There, when the daughters of King Lugh encounter Patrick and his clerics, they think the strangers might be men of the Cid, or earth gods, or a phantom. In other words, long before late folklore collected in the modern era, early medieval Christian texts already assume that Cid beings are a category of supernatural presence. And that gives us a myth correction worth making gently, but firmly. A common misconception is that the Tuatha Dé Danann are just tiny fairy creatures in the modern sense. But in the medieval saga literature, where they appear as kings, warriors, healers, and makers, they resemble what modern scholarship often calls the cycle of the gods. As modern reference summaries of the mythological cycle point out, Christian scribes often avoided calling them gods outright, but the stories preserve clear traces of pre-Christian divinities. So the Tuatha Dé Danann are not reduced into fairies by some single fall. They are transformed by centuries of retelling, by the needs of Christian scribes, by political genealogy, and by the way landscapes keep memory. Because once you say the defeated gods live in mounds, you have turned Ireland itself into a map of the invisible. And that transformation is the legend's final spell. Because it isn't only explaining why the gods are hidden, it's explaining why they are still here. So far, we've followed the story from arrival to kingship to a war that decides the balance between order and chaos. Now, we step back and ask, why did medieval Ireland keep telling it this way? The Tuatha Dé Danann legend isn't one story. It's a mythic machine that does several jobs at once. First, it explains sovereignty. The Lugh Fail cries out under the rightful king. The land itself knows legitimacy. In modern terms, the myth describes political authority as ecological and spiritual, bound to place, not merely to conquest. Second, it explains culture as craft. Lugh enters Tara not through bloodline alone, but by embodying every art, That is a myth about specialization and coordination, about a society that survives chaos because it can forge, heal, build, and remember. Third, it explains a landscape. Ireland is full of ancient mounds, structures far older than the medieval manuscripts that mention them. The Irish State Heritage Site for Brú-na-Bóinne describes Newgrange, Noath, and Douth as Neolithic passage tombs built around 3200 BC, an archaeological reality that predates the Tuatha Dé Danann stories by millennia. And yet, medieval myth links beings like the Dagda and later the Aes Sedha to such places. That's not wrong. It's myth doing what myth does. It takes the oldest features of a landscape and gives them inhabitants worthy of their gravity. Now, here's where Sykes' 2025 thesis helps us interpret the medieval context. Sykes argues that the Tuatha Dé Danann in Lebor Gabála Érenn can function as a political tool. If you can present a noble ancient race as a people rather than as gods, you can attach prestige and ancestry to dynasties, you can argue about territorial claims, and you can build an international identity for Ireland within a learned Christian world. That means the legend isn't only entertainment. It is infrastructure, a way of thinking with stories. And once you see that, the ending makes a different kind of sense. The Tuatha Dé Danann have to lose, at least on the surface, because the medieval pseudo-history wants the present human order to be legitimate. But the Tuatha Dé Danann can't be erased, because the mounds remain. The place names remain. The sense that the world has layers remains. So the legend solves its contradiction with a partition, above ground and below. The world of cattle and kings, visible, political, contested. And the world of the Cid, hidden, timeless, dangerous, beautiful. Modern readers still feel the pull of that partition. Not because anyone needs to believe it literally, but because it names an experience that's hard to speak in other terms, that a landscape can feel inhabited by memory, that power can be older than institutions, that the past can be present without being seen. And there's a final reason the story lasts. The Tuatha Dé Danann are a mirror for cultural change. They are what happens when an older religion becomes literature, when divinities become characters, when conquest becomes genealogy, when a sacred site becomes a fairy hill. And because this legend has been rewritten so many times, it teaches us, quietly, how to read. Not to hunt for one true version, but to listen for what each version needed. A people arriving in clouds, or in ships. A king who must be whole. A poet whose words can rot prosperity. A god of many arts. And at the end, a defeated tribe that doesn't die. It simply changes address. Let's quickly recap what we have learned in this episode. The Tuatha Dé Danann are the divine tribe at the heart of Ireland's mythological cycle, preserved most fully in medieval texts like Lebor Gabála Érenn and Cath Maige Tuired. Across variants, they arrive from northern isles or by sea, bring powerful symbols, the four treasures, and fight for sovereignty through the battles of Maige Tuired. And when the Milesians take the surface world, the legend doesn't erase the Tuatha Dé Danann. It relocates them into the Cid, so that the landscape itself becomes the border between history and the other world. If you want more episodes like this, legends told in full with careful sourcing and the messy beauty of their variants, follow Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened wherever you listen. Next time, we'll step into another Irish otherworld tale. And this tale will be a tale of Oisin and Niamh, a tale of a woman of the otherworld falling in love with a mortal. Until then, mind the old mounds.